Hello everyone and welcome back to Train Sim World 5, the Bernardino line in the Metrolin EM125 from Ponoma North to San Bernardino. Today we're doing something a bit different. We are talking about the Traitors Season 3, the US, up to episode 9 that came out there on Thursday, and I'm going to be giving you my analysis and views of this season. I thought I'd shake things up because I'm quite a big fan of the Traitors. It's really the only reality TV show that I like to watch. Now I don't know how many people who play Train Sim World actually watch this, but I thought let's see how this goes. So basically, for those of you who haven't watched the Traitors, do expect massive spoilers for most US and UK versions as well as the Danish and any English-speaking version, potentially, based on what analysis I decide to pull, but I'll give you a spoiler alert before I say it anyway. So basically, US Season 3, obviously spoiler alert. So we've had this ongoing battle between Danielle and Carolyn. So I think a lot of Reddit and a lot of the Survivor players that have kind of commented on Danielle's on Carolyn's gameplay were saying that they think Carolyn is going to win to the end. Even in the exit interviews, if you look at people like Tony, people like Rob, I think Sierra, a few others were saying that they think that I think Bob Harper maybe as well was saying that Carolyn will make it to the end as a traitor. And I think a lot of Reddit was also saying that. So obviously she was the underdog and the favourite to win. And look, I personally quite liked Carolyn as well. I really found her kind of like no nonsense and BS detector quite nice to watch, because a lot of times in the turret you have some trailers that kind of just go along and kind of let themselves be played, whereas Carolyn's like, look, I know what's happening here, I'm putting up with it. But nonetheless, that being said, I feel like Carolyn would have had a much better arc and actually would have been much nicer to see as a faithful, because I think while she did have this great ability of flying under the radar and kind of being able to see, okay, this is what like Rob and Danielle are playing at, and it's obviously not to the benefit of her own game, she wasn't actually have the other abilities that a traitor needs. I think she kind of played like a bit like, spoiler alert, US Season 2 traitor phase, where it was like, look, she was great at flying under the radar, not having any suspicion on her, but that wasn't enough to be a traitor. She didn't actually kind of put any plans forward. It's one thing to be able to identify the problems, it's another thing to actually say, okay, this is how we solve the problems. And people were saying, oh yeah, but she's getting very far, but I think a large part of that was because she kind of essentially allowed Rob and Danielle and Bob to make most of the decisions, which obviously meant that they can't really tie back to her because she hadn't anything to do with them. So like, in a way, of course she was going to fly under the radar. Obviously her gameplay was similar to Survivor and that worked very well, but I think also, as in Survivor 44, spoiler alert, she doesn't actually end up winning because you can't just fly under the radar as a traitor. And I kind of saw that in US Season 2 where Phaedra, once the heat came on her, she just completely collapsed. And I think a similar thing happened to Carolyn. Now of course you can say that Danielle did bring some of the heat onto her, and look, that is fair enough. Like, had Danielle not done that, would Carolyn have been clocked? Probably not. Although to be fair, when it came to the chess game, she kind of outdid herself. Yes, of course, Danielle kind of set up the trap for her, but at the same time, it wasn't really Danielle's job to, tell her, actually, this is not how a traitor should play. But so what I'm saying this is because I think actually the skills that brought her very far as a traitor would have brought her even further as a faithful. Why is that? Because she wouldn't have been really someone that people would vote out, realistically. And I think the only reason she got voted out as a traitor was because she was kind of acting sus, and once Danielle kind of pointed that out, that did kind of ruin her game. But if she was a faithful, she wouldn't have obviously had that traitor heat on her, because she wouldn't have played, she wouldn't have actually made the answers for the chess game, and she wouldn't have then obviously answered them in a way that people were like, wait a minute, how do you know the answers to this? And obviously people weren't really going to suspect her because she was kind of flying under the radar. But at the same time, the key advantage she had is that, a lot of people who kind of fly under the radar and get taken to the end, say e.g. like MJ in US Season 2, there was someone else in the Canadian version of the season 1, I can't remember their name, similar kind of story. But the difference there is that actually Carolyn can see what's going on, and she can, she knows who the she knows who the traitors are. And while people might underestimate her, it'll be a bit more like UK Season 2 with Jazz, where, spoiler alert, Harry was like, oh yeah, he didn't actually think that he was onto him when he was. And I think that's a key thing that would have brought her very far, because, well, for the same reason there's no sus on her as a traitor, there'd be even less sus on her as a faithful. And people were saying, well, actually she might get put in a coffin. And I guess what I'd say to that is that I think if she was put in the coffin, so I need to check what's happening here. Suppression and master control to idle. if she was put in a coffin, I think unlike Sierra and others that had heat on her, like you saw similar to in Opposite Nine, people like Ivor saying actually. I don't see her being able to pull off a traitor. I think something similar would have happened if she was a faithful and put in the coffin, and she wouldn't have been voted out because the reason Ivor switched is because Danielle essentially planted the seed on him to him that actually she's this like really smart person kind of playing it down, which obviously she was doing, but like Danielle obviously did that because she wanted to get rid of her as a traitor, something that wouldn't actually exist if she was a faithful. So I think actually she would have been brought to the end, and if she had the right people, like if it was just her and Gabby, obviously they would have taken each other to the end. Obviously her social game might have let her down a bit as a faithful, but I think there was more scenarios that she could have got to the end. Because I think had she gotten Danielle out, the problem is that Danielle was playing 20 steps ahead. She had planned out her whole game. On the other hand, Carolyn was playing by day, and she admitted this. And you can't really play traitor like as a traitor by day because you need to think ahead what the repercussions of your steps are. And we kind of see when Danielle let her play by day, choose the answers and choose who to kill, Carolyn didn't really do herself much justice. And I think this is why I was never really convinced that Carolyn was going to win as a traitor. It's because, look, she had the ability to fly under the radar, but like she wasn't really had the rest, like she wasn't really playing, I guess, a very kind of like planned game or very kind of like, okay, these are the steps I need to take. And she wasn't really great at articulating herself on the round table, especially against someone like Danielle. I think you kind of see that in Survivor as well. And look, I really like her character, but I just don't think... I think she would have done much better as a faithful. I think her skill set would have been much better as a faithful. I know why they put her in as a traitor, because obviously she'd fly under the radar, but that isn't enough. And I know a lot of people are kind of angry at Danielle because she... Sorry, where's this police suppression? People are angry at Danielle because she... There we go. She threw Carolyn under the bus. And look, I think there's two schools of thought here. I'm not necessarily in agreement with the view that, like, I don't really agree with all the hate that Danielle's been getting on Reddit and from people like Boston Rob and from, some of the game players. Because, to be honest, look, I think it's like a grey area. I think there's two sides to the story. At one point, like, look, it does make sense why when Danielle tried to, as we saw in the episode, try to, see where Carolyn stands. This was back in episode 5, I think, and see if she was on team, if she was in agreement with her. Carolyn didn't really give her much of a response. And look, as you can tell, like Survivor, like Carolyn works very well with some people, but like some personalities, she just doesn't work very well because like she's hard to read, and like that works great, but it also doesn't because like if you're hard to read, some people are just gonna naturally find you hard to trust. And from Danielle's perspective, okay, there's two survivors here. We always see in these games that like there's kind of like alliances, like the Big Brother people are in alliance. Derek, Britney. Well, I'm not sure if Derek and Britney, but like Derek, Danielle, Britney. The survivors are all in alliance kind of thing. And obviously when they're not, like Tony, you saw how pissed off he got at Rob for not being in alliance, or like voting him out and kind of not honouring the kind of survival code. And then it would make sense why Danielle would have thought, given the kind of lack of real committal answer from Carolyn, that they might be an alliance. And I think, although that wasn't the case at the time, you see Carolyn later say actually she would have liked to be in an alliance with she would have liked to be in an alliance with she would have liked to be in an alliance with Rob, and so like it, like at the end of the day, like her reasoning wasn't wrong. Obviously, like she doesn't know these players beforehand, but at the same time, I do think there's also due to what Carolyn said in that Danielle wanted to get her out because she would fly under the radar, and it makes sense. The same thing as how Dan played in season 2. He wanted to get Paige out because otherwise she would fly under the radar, and like there wouldn't really be any suspicion on her unless kind of a traitor called her out or unless a traitor kind of stitched her up. So, in that regard, like, I think it is fair to kind of be like, okay, I won't, like, I think it was both things. I think it was one, like, okay, Danielle was kind of like, I don't think I can trust Carolyn. At the same time, it's also like, let's reaffirm my own kind of agenda. So, like, I think both of those things existed at the same time. So that being said, like, I think that move to kind of be like, okay, let's take out Carolyn, take out Boston Rob, was one to kind of start planting the seeds of Carolyn, so that obviously when the time came a few days later, she could be like, I've got the receipts. It is, there's no crash physics in this. It is, it is Carolyn that's a traitor, and this is the evidence. And she presented a very convincing argument. I think that's the other thing. Like, I think the edits aren't really showing the full extent to Danielle's gameplay, because yes, she's playing a very risky game, but she's also kind of playing it like chess. And sometimes in chess, like, you have to be on the offense. A big issue with Carolyn was she was on the defense a lot, and that works great as a faithful or as a traitor until the mid game, but it doesn't work well towards the end game, because you can't win chess playing a defensive game. If any of you have ever played chess, you can't win chess by being defensive, because at some point the whoever's on the offensive is just going to end up smothering your king and calling checkmate. And that's exactly what happened to Carolyn, because, you know, she was on the defensive the whole time, but at some point Danielle just outplayed her, because Danielle was playing an offensive game, and that she was being like very proactive. She's like, okay, Carolyn is a traitor, I'm going to take her out, and this is the steps that are going to happen to do it. Another thing I think that hasn't been mentioned is, if you notice, when both Boston Rob and Carolyn get voted out, both nights there's a turret, and in the night of the turret, Danielle does something where she disarms herself. And what they mean by that is that she kind of tells them, like, she kind of makes herself seem like a powerless traitor. So let's go back first to Boston Rob. So when Boston Rob's about to get eliminated, so she votes for Rob the night before, so when Wes gets voted out. Then obviously she needs to regain Boston Rob's trust. Now what she does is she starts by saying, look, I don't agree with any of the people that Boston Rob wants to murder. And she makes a very clear point, no, I don't agree with this, I don't agree with this, and makes herself a difficult traitor. But what she does at the end is she reluctantly tells them, look, I agree. No, not that I agree, but she's like, okay, I will let you murder Derek, I'll let you have this one. And in a way she's saying, look, I'm giving up my power, I'm reluctantly compromising for your sake. But what happens is, by doing so, as kind of Derek pointed out in his exit interview, she kind of allows Rob to set himself up. Because by doing so, Rob makes a very obvious murder, and Derek is murdered, and now everyone's kind of like, okay, this is too obvious, Boston Rob is a traitor. And Danielle was like, okay, sure, you murdered him because I know the heat will be on you. But she's also catching Rob off guard, because then Rob's like, okay, Danielle's kind of on my side. Or look, Danielle doesn't seem to be in control in the turret. She's just shown that, like, you know, she doesn't want this to happen, but she's kind of like lifting her hands up and compromising. And I think this is a way for Danielle to kind of mask what she's about to do and make herself look like, look, I've given the game in your hands, when in fact she just stitched them up. And then if you look at what happened with Carolyn, it's the same kind of thing in a slightly different way. Carolyn wants to murder. Danielle makes a massive point about she wants to recruit Britney, all this. And she's like, okay, the theatrics are a bit much. Like, even for me, like, I was like, this is just too much. Like, oh my god, this is too much. But what she's doing there is, because obviously then we see the chess game, is that she's like, again, look, Carolyn, I'm giving my power, I'm reluctantly accepting, the game is in your court. But actually it's not, because now she's kind of caught Carolyn off guard, the similar way she catches Rob off guard, because now when they do the chess pieces, we see that she lets Carolyn make decisions that don't really help Carolyn's game. They kind of puts us on Carolyn, and we kind of see how Carolyn stitches herself up. But I think a large part of that was because Danielle played it smartly in that she let themselves stitch themselves up, and she did this in part by making herself seem like she's not a threat. And it's quite a smart gameplay move, because then again she votes out for Carolyn and she starts planting the seeds for Carolyn, but in a much more subtle way. And I think other people were saying part of Carolyn's downfall was the fact that she went out very aggressively against Danielle when she doesn't really do that usually. So I think, coming to that, look, I think it's clear that Danielle is playing a long game, and she's kind of planned it out from the start, like, okay, look, she needs to get Carolyn out because Carolyn will be under the radar. And I guess the reason she kind of went for Carolyn rather than Boston Rob is, one, because, okay, she kind of reaffirmed her own kind of like agenda by saying, look, I can't trust Carolyn. I think that's somewhat part of the case. I think there's also the case that she wanted to get Carolyn out, but most importantly, the reason she was like, let's target Carolyn is because she kind of knew Boston Rob was going to get voted out. There's no way Boston Rob was going to be carried through the own game. So there isn't really much reason for Danielle to actively go after Boston Rob, because Boston Rob is kind of going to banish himself. So then people are now saying that actually her recruiting Britney is a really bad move. It's going to end her game. That it's really silly. But what I think is, because it's been clear now that the edits are quite, I guess, not misleading, but they're not reflecting the whole story, because everyone was saying like, oh, Danielle looks like she's playing a terrible game, and I think her playing a messy game is part of the strategy, because it's a similar thing to Carolyn, like chaos and confusion, is just in a very kind of more overt way, because it was clear that obviously she wanted to recruit Britney from the start. But I don't necessarily think that she wants to bring Britney to the end. I think her plan was always, look, once they get out the other 3 traitors, they're going to be like, there's probably another female traitor in there, and it's probably going to be a big brother cast. Which means his source is either going to be on Britney, or it's going to be on Danielle. And of course, there's sus on her now, but like, out of the faithfuls remaining, you have Ivor, you have Tom Sandoval, you have Gabby, you have Dylan, who I kind of find a bit annoying personally. And then you have, I can't remember who else. Oh yeah, sorry, Dolores. And people are like, oh yeah, it's such a bad move recruiting Britney. But I think 1 is part of a plan, but 2, I think also actually she doesn't really have any other moves. Because whoever else she recruits, there's always going to be heat on it. It's going to be a female, and no one's going to be like, okay, I can take Danielle to the end. Because there's just too much heat on her. And also because, like, at this point, I don't think anyone really believes Tom or Ivor are traitors. Dylan is like the faithful angel. Dolores, people are kind of like, I don't think people are like paying too much attention to Dolores, and then Gabby obviously is kind of like also like a faithful. The only person there's a bit of sus on is Britney, and they see that because, like, you know, there was a whole thing about Derek saying that Britney might be a traitor, which Dylan knew, and there was like people voting Britney the night before kind of like Carolyn and Danielle went at each other. So it makes sense to kind of recruit Britney because it's the only person she can actively deflect on. And look, it's a risky strategy, but like in chess, sometimes you have to make sacrifices and hope they play out, because I don't think Danielle has any other better hand. I think what happens here is there's a few ways it plays out, but I think essentially Danielle's idea is, look, she needs to give them Britney in order to save her own game. And obviously there's the whole thing is like now they're best friends. Like obviously they started off with some beef and whatnot. I don't know what the story of the whole beef is. I don't know if there's a vengeance or not, but like I think probably there's 2 ways Danielle might play this, but I think what she's going to do is she's going to say, look, you saw how she was like, okay, look, Carolyn she was scared of because she was this quiet traitor that would murder her if she spoke out. I think she's going to be like with Britney, it's kind of like, look, Britney is a very kind of quiet player that's kind of playing a quiet game, similar to Carolyn, doesn't really speak much. And, you know, she stayed close to her because if she didn't, she would have been murdered. Kind of something along those lines, that like basically she was being a traitor angel. And then she's going to bring some receipts that something happened beforehand in the game. I can't remember if she knew that Derek had suspected her. I don't know. Or she might just make something up. I'm not too sure. But I think that's what it's going to be. It's like, look, that's your big brother traitor. Because then when they vote out Britney, it's kind of like, well, Britney wouldn't have recruited Danielle. If they talk about her being recruiting Danielle, she'd be like, that's too obvious. And also I think she's going to use the fact that if you remember a few roundtables back, or I think when someone was going after her, I think it was the episode before, episode 8, she said, look, why would I be a traitor? Why would I kill my 2 allies, Derek and someone else? It doesn't make sense. And she's going to use that to say, look, why is Britney still in this game? Why is she the only ally that I have left? Because she's a traitor keeping me in this game. She's going to do something along those lines, I think. Or the other way is, if she wins the seer power, and she's probably going to try and win the seer power, she might actually play it on Britney and then be like, Britney's a traitor. Although I think this might play out a bit differently than the UK one, because I think what you want to do is, if you have the seer power, you probably want to keep quiet about who you chose until after the last round table, because then people no longer reveal who they are, and then you can be like, listen, Britney's a traitor, I've got the seer power, because otherwise they're both going to get voted out, kind of like what happened in the UK season 3. So I think those are kind of like the 2 scenarios, and I think that was always her plan. I think her plan always was get close to Britney, make her feel like, you know, they are BFFs and, you know, they're right to die, and then betray her in the end, use her as the big brother shield, and get her voted out. Now, obviously, Britney is playing her own game, and there is the question of, like, you know, people saying, would Britney betray Danielle? Well, that is also quite possible. But nonetheless, I think, given the circumstances in question, I think I need to remove that break. I think those are kind of the only really moves that she has. Like, I don't think there was any other person she could have recruited. And I think this is also something that kind of Carolyn pointed out, like, before. Like, the thing with the traitors is, like, voting out your own traitor isn't ideal, because then you have to recruit someone else. And especially recruiting someone else towards the end game. This is one thing I was saying, that actually Carolyn probably could have won of a traitor if she was recruited towards this time of the game. Because we've seen in many seasons, especially if you look at, I think there's the New Zealand series, the New Zealand series, Canadian series, Danish series, there's been cases where someone that's quiet, flown under the radar, or Australian series as well, gets recruited and then just wins because, you know, they played as a faithful, and now there's no sus on them. So then they can kind of essentially use that to win as a traitor without having really done much of the strategizing as a traitor, because someone else did that. They just kind of threw the traitor in the bus and took the win for themselves. And I think Carolyn could have more effectively done that, because look, in that case, flying under the radar is really the only strategy you need if it's late enough in the game. But if you're from the start, like, you kind of need to be able to know who to murder, how to keep sus off you, and sure, Carolyn ended up by not making any active decisions, but then at some point you have to be able to have a plan. It's like, okay, what are you going to do with this other traitor? Because look, Carolyn knew from the get-go that, like, Danielle wasn't going to keep her in the game. But I think Carolyn didn't really actively do enough to plant seeds on Danielle until it was a bit too late. Yeah, she did that, like, argument, but, like, I think that argument kind of looked more like a personal kind of attack than more so of an actual, like, I think you're a traitor. But I think really the big issue, like, and so I don't really like, okay, I think some of the language Danielle used probably wasn't the best choice of words, but, like, I think that at the end of the game, like, I think Danielle is actually not playing a bad game. I think she's playing a very strategic game, which is, and also a very risky game that can backfire. But, like, look, I think kind of like she's going to play the game Dan wanted to play, which is actually doing it more effectively. Because to be honest, like, I wasn't happy with Dan in the season 2 of the US Traitors, because I think that just ruined the complete show, because it kind of exposed Phaedra with a plan that would have never worked, and kind of just made the game really easy for the faithfuls, and also, like, it made the absolutely insufferable Trishelle, I'm just not a fan of her whatsoever, win the game. Like, and people are like, because some people in Reddit are saying, oh my god, like, now this series is ruined, I don't want to see Danielle play this game, she's the worst traitor, all this. I'm like, hang on a minute, like, I think there's been far worse, like Will from season 1, Sam from the AU, Will from UK season 1, Trishelle, all of these are just in my like personal opinion, just really unlikable traitors or faithfuls that have won the game. And I think also, like, another thing people are saying is like, oh yeah, like, Danielle is not being honest with her confessionals. I think, just let's get this straight, because I think, apart from Carolyn, I think either the confessions are being edited in a we made this train come late, in a deceptive like, I guess in a manner that's not reflective of the whole truth of what all these players are actually saying. Because if you saw that interview, Stephanie said she knew Siri was always a traitor, but it wasn't really shown in the confessionals, even though she said it. It's either an editing thing, or it's everyone's kind of doing a bit of what Danielle is doing, and it's kind of like portraying things in the confessional in a way that's not entirely accurate. Because if you look at Dylan, I'm sorry, there's no way Dylan didn't know that Boston Rob was a traitor. You know, everyone thinks that Dylan, like, knew from the get-go that Danielle is a traitor, all this stuff. So I think all of this is pointing at that, look, they're all kind of playing, like, they're all kind of like, I think the US season works a bit differently than the UK season. I think that's part of the reason why it's actually nice, because, like, you don't want all of the series from all of the different countries being the exact same. You want a bit of variety. And that's the great thing about the way the US one is played. It's like, the US one's a lot of game players, it's a lot of, like, kind of like people kind of saying what they don't really mean. Like, okay, obviously in UK season 1 you had Wilf, and Wilf just drove me crazy because, like, all his fake crying and trying to manipulate the audience. It's like, oh, I feel so bad for voting out my own traitor, didn't have to vote out. Like, pure nonsense. Like, that, I was like, nah, I'm not having it. And, like, anytime I see that chap giving commentary, it's like, no one wants to listen to what you have to say. Well, okay, maybe that's not true, but, like, I certainly don't want to listen to what he has to say. because I think he's just a bit of a really just didn't like him as a traitor. I just think like it's one thing to like manipulate in the game, so another thing to try to manipulate the audience. But I think in the US seasons, that seems to be the case a lot more, in the sense that in the confessionals, people can't just say things that aren't true, like, you know, CJ and Trishelle saying, "Oh my God, you know, we didn't know for sure if MJ was a traitor." BS. So in reality, they were all playing a game, and they were all kind of like same characters. Like, for instance, when Boston Rob gets eliminated, you think Danielle's bad all around. Like, okay, later he kind of admits that in part that was just his jealousy driving him. But I think it's also, when he says that he would have brought Carolyn to the end, it's like, no. What you would have done is, you would have kept Carolyn as long as she didn't object to what you were saying. Because look, he took out, I think Carolyn's first analysis of him was correct. He took him out because he was making decisions, and you can't have two strong people with different views, you know, running the turret. So that's why he took him out. I think when she changed the view to say, oh yeah, it was necessary because he put some heat on him when they come up with the three things. I think that's a bit of an excuse. Like, it was clear that Boston Rob didn't want Bob in there, and I think that's kind of really what caused all of this mistrust in the turret. Because had Boston Rob not done that, then Carolyn and Danielle wouldn't have likely stopped trusting him, because there was no real reason for him to go after him. Like, it's kind of like the same thing that Danielle did to use, like the same way Danielle kind of used Carolyn's non-committal to use her own agenda of getting her out. The same thing Bob did. He's like, okay, this tiny thing where he said there was three people, one of them has to be a traitor. He used that as a way to be, okay, you've put hate on me, now I'm going to take you out. Like, completely unnecessary, just a way to fulfill his agenda. You know, with a very flimsy excuse. So I think when Carolyn went to change her mind, I don't agree with her on that view. I think also what that goes to show is, look, they're not, like, nobody in the confessional is like being fully honest, not just Danielle. It's kind of like a trend across this entry of the traitors, because I was sorry, Rob, you would have not taken Carolyn to the end. What would have happened is, the minute that Carolyn disagree with you, or the minute that, like, you know, you get towards the end and you see that there's only two traitors out, and you need to get another traitor out to, you know, obviously people know there's going to be these three traitors, you're going to show her under the bus. So this whole thing about he would have worked with her, come on, a load of nonsense. So, you know, I think it's just worth bearing that in mind with the confessionals, because I don't really understand why Danielle, for example, gets so much hate from the community when, like, she hasn't played that much differently from Dan in just more an effective way. And I think sometimes, like, this game just kind of like illustrates sometimes, like, not always, but I think in some instances people just have some kind of underlying biases, because the year before that everyone's like defending Dan, like, how dare people complain that he ruined Fedge's game, when all he did was ruin Fedge's game with a plan that would have never worked. But then when Danielle does the same thing to Carolyn, all of a sudden, how dare Danielle does that? Like, you know, it's just, I think there's a lot of inconsistency sometimes in, like, you know, people's arguments, and I think that kind of sometimes just illustrates obviously some sort of biases that people have in these, like, and that's, look, I think sometimes people have underlying biases. Like, I think Trishelle, for example, this is why I didn't like Trishelle, because I think when she went after Peppermint in episode 1, that was just her going after Trishelle, after Peppermint, because she had an underlying, you know, bias and microaggression, and the fact that she won was just such a sour taste in my mouth. But I think, you know, that's kind of sometimes what happens in these series is people's sometimes conscious, sometimes subconscious bias, you know, come to the forefront. So, you know, like, I think sometimes, like, what's said about Danielle is just blown completely out of proportion, and I think everyone's kind of double speaking, and this is kind of something that happened in the UK version as well, because, like, when Leanne and Jake were like, oh yeah, we don't know if Frankie's a traitor, oh, we don't know if, like, who was the other person, what was their name, Alexander, don't know if there's a traitor. I was like, you guys know they're not traitors, you just want the money. So, like, people do this all the time, but people don't want to seem greedy on TV, so they pretend to be like, oh, I don't know, why do they, you know, all these crocodile tears. And look, I mean, I guess, like, unfortunately, part of the Traitors game is not just deceiving the other players in the castle. Sometimes it seems to be deceiving also, actually, the audience. And, you know, I think a lot of times people can see through that. So, like, I think that's why, for instance, like, Harry was granted the traitor, because, look, he was like, look, I know what this might look like, and I don't care. It's like, fine, He's calling a spade a spade. He's not trying to manipulate both us and the audience. And it's like not doing these fake tears that one of us do, these crocodile tears. So, you know, and I think, to be honest, I think the US Season 3 has been quite exciting. I just wish Boston Rob wasn't the traitor. And was like, there's no reason to put him in, because he kind of just, it was kind of like a Dan, kind of tanked Bob the Drag Queen's game. I think Bob the Drag Queen would have been a lot more entertaining to watch further into the series than Boston Rob, who was just kind of did the same kind of like, you know, oh, big man moves kind of thing. And like at the end of the day, they all just kind of backfired, and it also just completely destroyed any trust between Danielle and Carolyn. Although, you know, probably that would have played out in a similar manner, but I think kind of then like, the reason I think Boston Rob didn't like Danielle was not that like, oh, she was playing a bad game, it's just that he couldn't get rid of her. Because the reality was Boston Rob was like a quiet traitor that just kind of do what they're told, don't question him, kind of let him take control. And, you know, he managed to get Bob the Drag Queen, he wasn't doing, like, he was obviously not letting him take control. But Danielle he couldn't take out, because there's no way for him to kind of, you know, point at Danielle without like just kind of completely exposing himself. And I think that's why he was kind of salty at Danielle. I think that, like, at the end of the day, his comments about Danielle, I don't think are actually accurate. I think it's just him being like, look, trying to just kind of like, you know, he just wanted to get rid of the other strong traitors, in the sense of like the ones that are making like decisions and kind of like strong personality and strong-willed. I think that's it. Like, I'm not saying that Carolyn was a weak traitor, but it's more like he viewed Carolyn as someone that he can, you know, I'm sure they'll kind of like, look, she'll let him make the decisions, whereas Danielle wouldn't do that. But he just didn't have a path of taking Danielle out, realistically. So I think that's why he was kind of like annoyed at Danielle. That's why he's kind of like, oh, she's a bad game player. It's like, no, look, she just outplayed you, Rob. That's it. I think he kind of, afterwards in exit interviews, kind of like admitted that. But look, folks, I mean, overall, you know, to be honest, like, I'm kind of glad, like, Carolyn and Danielle were, like, the, you know, outlasted Rob, because they're both quite entertaining to watch, and, like, I loved Carolyn's kind of, like, you know, I see what you're doing, like, you know, no nonsense approach, but I think I think the issue was, like, she kind of played like Survivor, but not realising Survivor got her to the end, but didn't get her the win. And unfortunately, that's what happened this season. And I think maybe if she was a faithful, she would have ended up playing a much more successful game. But yeah, I'm really curious to hear what you guys think. Thanks very much for watching, and until next time, let me know if we should make such a commentary for the next series, for the next episode. That's it for now. Until next time.